Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Roll the Dice with Dave. I hope everybody's having a good evening tonight. Before we get started, anybody who is tuning in live on either Facebook or YouTube, if you can please do me a favor and hit that like button, it would greatly be appreciated. Also, if you are watching on either Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and share it. Go ahead and let everybody know that you're checking out Roll the Dice with Dave tonight, live on a Tuesday night. We have a great guest tonight. I'm actually been looking forward to speaking with this guest for a while. It is a topic of conversation a lot of people get into. We're going to be talking some criminology tonight, and I think everybody's really going to enjoy listening to my guest this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him out in just a second. Again, if you are watching on Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to Roll the Dice with Dave on Facebook or on YouTube. Follow. This is where you can get the updates on guests that I'm going to be speaking with, as well as future events and different guests that are going to be coming on. So we're going to go ahead and get started tonight, and I'm going to bring out my guest, Josh Beal, or do you prefer Joshua?
Either one's fine.
Either one's fine. All right. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm really excited to have you on. I've been looking forward to this for a while. But before we get started, I actually want to go ahead and give you the opportunity if you can just introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Josh Beal. Like you said, I am a criminology professor. I got my PhD at the University of Florida, so obviously always go Gators. And I was trained under a social psychologist in a criminology department. So I have kind of a unique perspective because a lot of my coursework was in criminology, but a lot of the research and training I had was under a social psychologist. And so I kind of am myself personally kind of a little interdisciplinary when it comes to studying human behavior.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I did not realize that. So if you don't mind, I just want to touch on a couple of things because I've had a chance to get to know you a little bit over the last year and a half. I've been at Flagler College. But how long have you been at Flagler College?
I started in the fall of 2016.
Okay, so we're only about 3 years apart. So not too far apart there. One of the things I have learned about you is you drive this pretty badass Cadillac. Do you mind telling the story about it? Because I heard the story and I thought that was the coolest thing about that Cadillac that you drive.
Yeah, so it was my grandfather's Cadillac, and he unfortunately my first year at Flagler, he passed away really early on, kind of in my first year, and so my mother said I was driving a little Honda Civic at the time, and my mom said if you want an upgrade, we have an opportunity for you, and so that's that.
Well, what's funny is I could always tell, like when you're on campus, because when I see him, I'm like, oh, Josh is here, right? So it's very distinct, especially in that parking lot that we park in. There's two cars that I always know who's there. Yours and Zach Cole's is the other one because he's got that big ass Gator plate in the front of his orange car, right? So you always see the Gator plate there. Here's another interesting story, and hopefully you don't mind telling this story. I know you're married. Do you mind telling the story about how you met your wife?
So I was a cheerleader at the University of Florida in undergrad, and I graduated, and my wife tried out for the cheerleading team as a freshman, and I was still kind of helping out with the cheerleading team while I was in grad school pursuing my PhD. And so my wife and I met that way, and because of our pep and spirit, I guess.
No, I think that was a great story. When I heard it, I was like, no way. I was like, Beal was a cheerleader? And they were like, yeah, so was his wife. I was like, she was a cheerleader too? And then somebody pulled up your Facebook page, and I think at your wedding, you have her like in a one-handed she's like in a handstand on your hand. And I was like, that is the coolest thing, man.
Yeah.
You got a lot of layers, brother. I tell you what, you got a lot of layers. It's awesome.
I'm old and washed up now, so don't ask us to do any of that anymore.
Okay, well, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, how old are you? You said you're old and washed up. How old are you?
I'm 32.
Oh, dude, you're still so young. What I'd give to have my 32-year-old body back, man. I'm 47. And I feel like I'm falling apart every day. So. Well,
after several years of cheerleading at the Division I level, I feel like I'm about 57 or 67. So my old joints now.
Old joint. So we have Jessica's tuned in. She said you're such a cheerleader, Josh. So you got a fan there. So I want to move into the review, right? One of the things that I've noticed that I've gotten into over the years, and it's probably because my dad spent some time as a law enforcement officer. I say some time, almost 30 years of his life in law enforcement in New York. I've really gotten into crime dramas, right? So crime drama series, even documentaries. So before we get moving on into talking about what you do specifically, the question I have is, are you into any crime dramas that you follow? Are you into any documentary series that revolve around crime and criminology?
Very, very few. I actually don't. There's a couple reasons. Number one is, if you spend all day doing something, when you go home and relax, you don't want to keep doing that same thing, right? And so I don't really watch a lot of them. Also, I find a lot of crime, like crime TV shows and crime dramas are meant for entertainment, but it just annoys me how wildly inaccurate they are. And so I don't, it's kind of like doctors don't watch Grey's Anatomy because it bothers them. And then a lot of, it's probably just maybe it's my own impatience, but a lot of crime dramas on TV and stuff, they stretch out what could be a 10-minute story about this crime that took place. They stretch it out for an hour and they're like, then the police discovered this thing. And it's like, well, okay, they seem to found that day one. Why did we wait until 45 minutes into the show to drop this bombshell that they knew about?
So I just recently watched the Netflix 4-part docuseries on the Night Stalker. About, I believe it was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker out in California. And it's like I just couldn't get away from it. I just couldn't stop watching it, right? So I watched all 4, and they're like an hour and I think 15 hour and 20 minutes each. And I sat there. Next thing you know, I'm going, oh crap, I just wasted my whole day watching this. What threw me a little bit for a loop was how I want to say the glorification of some of the pieces, because I was still pretty young, but I remember that being talked about, and I'm a young kid in New York, and this is taking place on the other side of the country. But now I just find myself being hooked into these different crime dramas. I don't know if it's Corona and we're just stuck at home. So I figured I had to ask a criminology professional if they are into it. And I recently just finished binge watching True Detective, the first season on HBO. So that's why I was like, I just got to ask Josh, does he watch these things?
If Tiger King counts as a true crime, I did watch that. I don't know if that counts.
All right, so I got to ask, do you think Carol Baskin killed her husband and fed him to the tigers?
Who knows? I mean, I like to joke around that she probably did, but in all seriousness, I mean, without, I try and withhold judgment because I think that oftentimes we do kind of trial by media instead of real trials. And so I try and, I might joke around about it, but I don't have a real strong opinion about it one way or the other.
No, that's cool, man. I appreciate that. So I want to move to the next topic real quick and talk to you from a customer perspective, right? And I'm sure you've traveled around and things like that. Is there anything that comes to mind when you travel that you're sitting there going, ooh, we got to pay attention to this to make sure we're not a victim of any kind of crime when we're traveling?
So that's actually a really interesting question. And one of the things that is actually very interesting about people that travel, right, be it on cruises and in hotel rooms and stuff, is oftentimes if stuff does get stolen from us, we typically have a tendency to think we just forgot to pack it when we left, right? And so crimes in hotel rooms, crimes on cruise ships, especially like kind of petty theft crimes, are actually fairly common. And for that reason, you don't realize it's missing until you're so far away from where you forgot it anyway that you just typically kind of blame yourself and say, golly, I guess I didn't pack that thing I thought I packed. Or you're in such a tight time frame to get to your next thing that you don't have that much time to look for it or even kind of launch an investigation. Obviously, something big like if you misplaced a laptop or something, you'd probably notice. But jewelry especially is one of those things that can kind of go missing very, very easily. And so from my perspective, I always just kind of make sure whenever I'm staying in a hotel room, I know housekeeping is going to come in, and I don't let housekeeping come in, put up a do not disturb sign, or I just always make sure any sort of valuables are put in places that housekeeping really has no business going into and wouldn't think to look for certain valuables.
And it's funny you mentioned that because in all my years, I don't think I've ever, and I teach in the industry. I've been in the industry. I don't think I've ever sat there and been like, oh man, somebody stole something out of my room, right? Because
Right.
a lot of times it's clothes, it's maybe just small little pieces of things here and there. I've never, because I always tell people you don't want to pass judgment. You don't know if it's housekeeping or not, and you could have just lost it. I may have just been getting robbed from several different times and just been like, man, hey babe, do you know where I put that? You know, whatever, and just can't find it. Now I do agree with you. If a laptop goes missing, somebody's going to pay attention to that.
Right.
But it's funny you mentioned that because I've done that throughout pretty much my entire life. Just chalked it up to, oh, I must have just forgotten it, or man, I left it in the room. Call up front desk. Hey, if you guys find anything, can you just send it back? And then you never hear from them again, and then you don't even think twice about it. To touch on something, have you ever avoided a place as a potential travel destination because you were worried about the crime that may exist in that area?
I wouldn't say I've avoided. I guess it depends on what you mean by particular place. So, like, with traveling with cheerleading quite a bit in the SEC, we would routinely go to New Orleans for basketball tournaments, the Sugar Bowl, and we were obviously happy to go to New Orleans. We would walk up and down Bourbon Street and enjoy all that New Orleans had to offer. There were certain areas of, you don't really want to stray too far off of Bourbon Street, and I think a lot of that is probably more innuendo than actual risk that you're in. But it's always like, oh my gosh, don't travel off Bourbon Street or you're gonna have a kidney removed or something and sold. And it's like, you don't hear about hundreds of cases a year of people losing kidneys wandering off of Bourbon Street in New Orleans and stuff. And so, which is an interesting kind of idea, the fear of crime versus your actual chances of getting victimized. There's a pretty distinct difference between those two. Okay. And so people say, don't walk down dark alleys, or like if you're out in the middle of the woods, it's scary because what if the Texas Chainsaw Massacre guy comes out and gets you or whatever, right? And it's like, well, the odds of that happening are actually pretty slim in most dark alleys and in most woods.
Well, it's funny you say that because St. Augustine relies so much on tourism. We have the ghost tours. I've gone on a couple of ghost tours. That's almost the first thing everybody says as they're wrapping up a tour. Hey, make sure you're not walking down any dark alleys. St. Augustine, even though it looks pretty, it can be as dangerous as some of these other cities. And you can almost see everybody kind of like, oh. And then almost the tour breaks up and people are looking at other people like, are they going in my same direction? And then can I stay with them? So it's funny you mentioned that because I've never felt unsafe in St. Augustine. Even there are some dark places down by campus. But that's always something that's said on our tours down here. So that's an interesting point you make. Next question, kind of a little follow-up piece from there. As a criminologist, have you heard of anything as far as crime trends that are coming up that tourists should be watching out for if they travel?
I suppose, again, it kind of depends on where you're going. There's certain countries that might be more prone to pickpocketing crimes and stuff. There's certain, like, I wouldn't probably travel to Syria right now. And so it just kind of depends. There's not really, as far as I'm aware, too terribly many. And the vast majority of people that are victimized on vacations are victimized by things like kind of pickpocketing and kind of small theft of items and stuff. And so it's not it's pretty rare for somebody to be victimized violently, pretty seriously, unless they are kind of looking for it when they travel, or if they are just over consuming at adult beverages at certain establishments and just that always can cause problems.
So I want to throw this out there, just a little tidbit of information. So being in hospitality, I'm reading all kinds of analytics and stuff, and I came across an article, and I thought it was a little unjust the way it was formatted, but it made me think of you because of this conversation we're having today. And it said potential top tourist destinations if you want to get murdered, right? So I was like, oh, so it was just kind of this little opinion piece, but they pulled some numbers and they listed the top places that have the highest murder per 100,000 people. And these were the ones that came up. And when I looked at them, I'm like, oh, these are places that people always say they want to go. So you had St. Lucia, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Bahamas, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, Belize, and Jamaica came in at number one with 45.1 murders per 100,000 people. But I just thought if you don't read the article in its entirety and just kind of look at the title to get people, a lot of people may go, man, I'm not going to Jamaica. I don't want to get killed. What they failed in that they can't put in the title is that's like in all of Jamaica. So when you look at some of the neighborhoods, it's really happening in neighborhoods, not necessarily at tourist attractions.
Well, and not only that, my wife and I actually, prior to COVID, were supposed to go down to a sandals resort in Jamaica, and it's rescheduled for this year, but we were just actually talking about it tonight. We're probably going to have to reschedule it again because of travel restrictions. But the vast majority of homicides that take place are by people that you're either somehow acquainted with or connected with in some capacity. And so as a tourist going down, Jamaicans or any place that's a tourist destination, they have very, very little incentive to hurt tourists, because if the tourism industry tanks, like Jamaica doesn't really have that much else that it has in terms of an economy. And so it needs tourist dollars. It needs tourism to come to it. So does St. Lucia, so do the Bahamas. And so there's actually kind of almost a reverence for the tourist, and you're not really all that at risk because they don't want that to cause tourism to die, and then therefore the economy of the country to die either.
So based on what you just said, I'm more likely, if I'm taking a vacation, not to be killed by a Jamaican, but more likely to be killed by my wife on vacation, is what you're telling me.
I am certain that's true for me.
All right. Thanks for that. Moving on to the next little piece. In your opinion, so I put out a little opinion poll I posted online. And the question I had for people who wanted to answer, is the American criminal justice system fair? 100% of the people that responded said, no, it is not fair. What is your take on that 100% of the people? Now, granted, I will say this, it was only about 25, I think, people that answered, but still all 25 people said no. They think the criminal justice system is unfair in this country. What are your thoughts on that little opinion poll piece?
Well, I think that one of the things, as social scientists in general, that we always try and do is make sure we know what we mean by the terms that we're using. And so, not to make this too overly philosophical, but what is fair, right? What do we mean by fair? Do we mean that if you commit a crime, you definitely get punished for it 100% of the time, no discretion? Do we mean that certain groups of people need to be treated the exact same as all the other groups of people? And so whenever we talk about the fairness in our system, it's always an interesting kind of dialogue, because what we typically find is what we actually want is not necessarily fair. What we typically say is, this person seems to have gotten away with something, I want to get away with it too, right? Or this group gets away with something, why can't my group get away with this also? But that's not really what fairness is. If we're going to go like in a very strict definition, right? If you commit a crime, you should be punished for it. Then it's certainly not fair, because the vast majority of crime goes unreported, and therefore there's no punishment for it. It is pretty uncontroversial to say that if you have money, you're able to navigate the system better than if you don't have money. There's, of course, questions of, is that fair or not? Is there two separate systems of justice then, if you have money or not? The debate kind of goes, well, if you're willing to utilize your resources in a way to get you a better attorney, right? I think people tend to think if you're wealthy, you're guaranteed to not get punished. And that's certainly not true, because Martha Stewart went to jail for a little while, right? And so I think that it isn't fair. And I would agree that that's a pretty accurate statement, but I don't think it is as unfair and as ripe with problems as typically the media and the general society believe it to be.
Okay, so I want to kind of ask a follow-up just to get your thoughts on this. Are there any pockets where you as a criminologist will sit there and look and go, oh yeah, that's not fair, the way kind of things go? Yes, and the ideas that come up aren't necessarily, they're kind of practical problems that in the application of justice versus
we need to burn the whole system down and start over, right? And so I don't like the fact that in practice, prosecutors and public defenders will sit down and kind of negotiate cases as groups with each other. So I'll give you a lighter deal on this one if you give me a better deal on this one. I don't like the fact that individual cases might be decided in comparison to other cases because each case should be individualized, right? I don't like the fact that it seems as though people with money, as the comment says here, gets you better representation. I think that that's true. I also think, though, that if we really look at crime in general, a lot of crimes that take place don't necessarily – they're not equally distributed across all groups of people, right? And so it makes sense on its face, and before everyone blows up the comment section, it makes sense that people living in poverty commit more crime because, and for a lot of things, right, people that have money don't need to do certain things, right? So like, I'm not going to, I mean, not that criminology professors at Flagler are, backflipping into our pools of cash, but I can afford groceries, right? So I don't need to steal in order to feed my family. Some people might be forced, and especially in a 2020 COVID kind of situation, to maybe turn to some sort of deviant behavior in order to just float their families, right? And so while those things are not fair on their face, we also need to dig a little deeper into what's the real problem, right? The problem is not that money gets you better representation. The problem is that there's poverty that's kind of causing people to turn to crime as a last resort to solve problems that they have, right? And so it's a much more nuanced and much more complicated conversation than an easy soundbite on CNN or Fox News would lead one to believe.
Well, trust me, I'm not going to go ahead and like edit this so it's going to work that way to make you guys feel look bad. But it's funny because my sons and I were having a conversation, and I said, man, if I ever get busted for a crime and I have to rely on a public defender, y'all might as well kiss your dad's ass goodbye because I'll probably never get out of jail, right? So that was because I don't have the money to go get, like a Johnny Cochran, right? So
right. I don't, and I don't want that. And this is, and I totally get the joke, and I totally, I don't disagree with you. If I got arrested, I would, take out a second mortgage on the house if I had to in order.
Exactly.
But that's also not. I mean, the public defender's office works hard, and they really do try their best. It's just the reality is there's more cases than they reasonably could try. In fact, there's even been some scholarship to suggest that if every public defender just refused plea bargains and just said, nope, we're taking every case to trial, it would crash our entire criminal justice system because we rely so heavily, about 90 to 95% of cases are pled out. We rely so heavily on plea bargaining that if all public defenders did was just say, nope, we're taking them all to trial, we'd have to stop arresting people. We'd have to stop charging people because our jails would get too full immediately. And so public defenders will bristle at the idea that they're not working hard. They're definitely putting in a tremendous amount of time, and they're not getting paid well at all. But also the government doesn't want to fund. It's not a big sexy project to be like, and I'm doubling the public defender's office now. We're using taxpayer dollars for that. Because it's like, well, why are we putting all this money toward people that have broken the law then? And so it's just not a popular campaigning mechanism, and therefore we just don't fund it the way it needs to be funded.
So cool. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. I really appreciate it. Moving on to the next little piece, we're going to get into some of your areas that you've been involved with, and I'm really fascinated with this topic. So one of the topics you and I that you had mentioned that you are involved with is the jury selection process. Do you mind just giving us an explanation of where do you come into play in the jury selection process?
Of course. So I was, like I said, trained under a social psychologist whose area of expertise is jury decision making. And so, she made, like all advisors do, they kind of make carbon copies of themselves to send out into the world. So I will occasionally consult on cases, and it's actually a lot of what we do in our consulting. We will help with jury selection sometimes, and there's ways you can frame questions in jury selection to try and get at attitudes and behaviors that you kind of want to uncover before a trial takes place. But a lot of the work that we do is actually before the trial even starts, before the juries and panels or anything else, where we kind of view any trial as a basic empirical question. And that question is, will the jury believe this argument or not? And you can test that, right? And so we can get a group of people into a room and more or less in an abbreviated, a severely abbreviated fashion, kind of try a case and say to the jurors that witness that, what did you think about this? What were the strong arguments? What were the weak arguments? What did you find persuasive? What did you not believe? And really kind of see how they come to their decision making. And that can then help inform trial strategy to where it might not even really matter. A lot of people like this idea of a jury profile, and we need to, if I can just ask one or two questions, I know that that's my juror now. That's really not overwhelmingly what we're trying to do. We're trying to say what are persuasive arguments that the group as a whole is going to find persuasive to try and help our side one way or the other.
So a follow-up question, when you say your side, are you contacted by both prosecution and defense, or do you typically end up more on one side and the other? Have you kind of found yourself plopped in one way or the other?
So, actually, ironically enough, even though I'm a criminologist, the vast majority of cases that I find myself working are civil cases, and so they're not even necessarily criminal cases. And if, in case people don't know, civil cases are just any sort of lawsuit that's not a violation of the criminal law. So it could be business versus business. It could be individual versus corporation, a contract dispute. When jury consultants in any capacity are used in criminal cases, they're typically used by defendants just because not to exacerbate the two systems of justice that I've talked about, but it is fairly expensive to hire someone to come in and do all this work on top of a lawyer that you're already paying for. And so it is typically more toward defendants, but I'm actually, from a practical standpoint, a little more okay with that because the state has a tremendous amount of resources that a lot of defendants don't have. And I am of the personal opinion that we should make it as difficult as possible to convict people in court, and that the evidence needs to be very, very strong in order to take away your rights in some capacity. And so if it does tilt the cards a little bit in the favor of the defense in a criminal case, I think that that's the way it needs to be.
Cool, man. I tell you, that's some interesting stuff, because you see sometimes in movies that they're sitting there and their attorneys are discounting people and all that. So you've been involved in that consulting process to help really determine where you want, hopefully, the jury to fall, so that this way the jury is looking at your case like, hey, this is a legit argument that we can believe.
Right. And also some of it is also just, writing good questions, because there's, as you know from taking research methods classes, it's actually pretty complicated to write good questions. And so whether it be surveys or any other research. And so that also kind of helps to make sure that you're asking questions in a way that you actually get diagnostic information.
So one of the questions that came up, do you think, or I guess I'll ask it, does race play a factor in the jury selection process?
Oh, certainly it can. And it really kind of depends what kind of case you're working, right? And so there are times, a lot of the historical cases are cases where, there are I'm enjoying the question also, but to get back to the serious question about race, there are a lot of the historical cases are where we're trying to systematically, and by we, I don't mean me personally, but where the system has systematically tried to exclude minorities from serving on juries. But there's also some cases where it's actually very, very beneficial to try and have minorities on the juries. And in fact, the O.J. Simpson case is a beautiful case of both sides actually had access to jury consultants for this case. The prosecution didn't listen to theirs, the defense did, and they ended up both kind of trying to pick the same jurors. And obviously, because the defense listened to their consultants, they actually ended up with a very favorable jury right out of the outset. Specifically with this question, do I believe pop culture trials taint the fairness of our judicial system? I don't think that the trials in and of themselves taint the fairness, I absolutely agree that the media taints the fairness. There are a lot of cases where, like, if I were to ask anyone watching right now what evidence anyone saw about Casey Anthony, O.J. Simpson, George Zimmerman, what evidence did you physically see and examine to determine that they were guilty? Probably the vast majority of people would say, I didn't see anything. We were told this person did it, right? And so there's supposed to be an assumption of innocence, and you're innocent until proven guilty. That, when the media gets involved especially, it is very, very rare that the assumption is innocence versus guilt. And so you have a much higher bar to overcome then in those pop media cases, because of the fact that people are going into it kind of assuming this is the guilty party.
And I could also imagine just the persona of the person. So I'll go ahead and stick with the OJ case as Amber brought up. The likableness of OJ Simpson, right? As a lot of people that saw him, they saw him as a likable person. He was the Hertz guy, right? Running through the airport, hopping over luggage. He was a Heisman Trophy winning running back for the Buffalo. You know what I mean? So there were a lot of things that people just embraced him. So even going through this process, there's a lot of people that made up their mind, almost very similar to the situation with R. Kelly, right? There's still some people that, even with some of these videos that come out and what show, they have this love for R. Kelly that they're like innocent until proven guilty. There's nothing you're going to show me right now that's going to make me think otherwise. So I think that's what makes some of these pop culture cases difficult. Now I'm gonna put you on the spot as a follow up to this OJ one. So do you think OJ did it, man?
I
know I'm putting you on the spot.
No. I'm trying to
ask. I had to ask.
Growing up, I always just accepted the fact that he must have done it, right? And did he do it? Probably. Not too many people that didn't commit a crime end up writing a book saying, here's what I would have done if I did it, but I didn't do it. Like, I've still got a lot of reasons why I could have done it. And so it's like he's done a lot of things to kind of taint his own reputation.
So you felt he's like admitting and purging so he can clean his soul.
Right.
Saying, if I did it, this is how I would do it. And he's actually telling people this is how he did it.
Right. But I mean, in that case, there were some serious chain of custody issues with evidence. The detective, there's no question about the fact that the detective that was processing evidence, like, clearly was like a little too in love with Hitler. The prosecution allowing OJ to try on the glove was not a bright idea at all, because there's a lot of ways, like, I can be like, look, one arm's longer than the other, and they're not, right? And so you don't typically throw stuff to the defendant like that to give them the opportunity to get acquitted. But one of the things that is very, very interesting is that one of the big mistakes that the prosecution made was suggesting that basically OJ was this super predator, terrible person. I mean, a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, a very popular guy. You can't say this is a career criminal that's bent on, trying to murder people. And that to the African American community especially was very, very offensive, because he was one of the kind of first, like, big black heroes. Yeah. And it felt like a system that was trying to suppress him, which is a problem.
Yeah, because I don't think he did it right, but that's just me. So we'll go ahead and leave there, and we'll move on to the next piece.
Fine. Yeah, I mean, only OJ and God know right now, right?
I know, that's true. So we'll move on to the next piece. Yeah. Witness behavior was another conversation we had regarding around criminology in one of your areas. Do you mind explaining kind of what exactly is witness behavior?
Right. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. There are witnesses, like eyewitnesses, that witness a crime that happened. There's alibi witnesses in courts. Witnesses come and testify in court. The areas that I look at witness behavior the most are personally in alibi corroboration areas, because this is an eyewitness, right? Presumably this is very strong evidence that this person could not have possibly committed this crime. I was with them at the time. I I know they couldn't have done it. And yet we see people sometimes still getting convicted with alibi witnesses that say, no, they couldn't have done it. They were with me and we weren't there. I also am interested in how witnesses behave in trials, especially as it relates to how jurors view how witnesses behave. You can have a very, very strong case, but if the witnesses that are testifying on your behalf are bad, you can blow your whole case. The only way the jury really gets evidence is through witnesses. Attorneys can't present evidence. The judge can't present evidence. Witnesses have to present that to the jury. And so you can have a very, very good case that is completely ruined by witnesses that are not adequately prepared or liked by the jury, which is a huge problem. So some of what I do in the consulting world is trying to help attorneys and witnesses be as persuasive as possible. And some of the things we'll look at is if we have a choice of these two or these three experts, which one do jurors like better to use in a case?
So I have a follow-up to that. Why do you think people are so quick if I came out, and now granted, I am a faculty member at Flagler, I feel I have a certain level of goodness, right, tied to me as a person, that if I came out and said, I'm pretty sure Josh Beal is guilty, he's the guy who did X, Y, and Z, that they would take my word for it if I said, I think he did it because I think he's the guy I saw. Why are they so quick to jump on that if you're saying, hey, I didn't do it, and maybe the witness you were with, and I know this is all hypothetical, is a bad person who maybe is a drug dealer or something like that. And they were like, no, Josh was with me. We were getting pizza. And I'm like, nah, man, I could have swore I saw. Why are people just so quick to say he's a good guy? He's got to be telling the truth. That guy's just got to be lying.
So, that's a very complicated question, but it's a very good question that a lot of people have. And so one of the things that is very, very persuasive to a jury is if someone sits in a courtroom and says, that's the person who did it, how do you dispute it? They saw it, right? They were there. How do you tell them that they didn't see it? If someone's like, well, no, he was with me. One of the biggest problems with alibis is typically an alibi, regardless of whether you're a good person or a bad person, typically you're with someone you know. So presumably your wife and kids are at your house right now, right? They also have a tremendous amount of motivation to lie for you because, well, hopefully, because they don't want them to have to go to jail, right? And whereas a lot of eyewitnesses to crimes might not have that same relationship. And so if you have a stranger saying, I saw him do it, but his wife says, no, I promise we were at home. Well, already it doesn't feel like it passes the sniff test, right? It's like, well, of course his wife is going to say that because she wants him at home. And so when those kind of relationships are present, it becomes very complicated. Also, to be an eyewitness, you kind of feel like you're doing a good thing by being like, look, I'm helping solve this crime. I'm part of the process. Look at me go. To be an alibi, if you don't know the person, do you really want to get dragged into court? Do you really want your credibility questioned? Do you really want to be part of the puzzle with this guy that you don't really know? So you don't really necessarily want to help him, and so, or really care if you help him or not. And so there's a lot of just kind of general humanness to this, where we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves as eyewitnesses, and as alibis, it feels like a lot of work.
All right, cool. I kind of want to look at the last two topics we talked about combined together. Have you ever done any what you would consider maybe high profile cases where you helped to influence the selection of the jury and also had maybe issues with witnesses? So I know that's the last two things.
Right. And the wonderful thing about the work that I do is that it is all behind the scenes and typically also comes with judicial orders that I'm not allowed to talk about any of the work I do because of the fact that it does have such potential to impact the case. So I can't really, there have been high profile cases that I'm sure you've heard of that I've helped out on, but I can't really go into detail about what those cases are, which is a very unsatisfying answer. I know.
No, it's not, because it's one of those things you could tell us, but then you'd have to kill us, and then
Exactly.
you could get in trouble because there could be an eyewitness, and your wife would be the alibi that you didn't kill us,
Well,
right?
and my
So,
wife's not even home right now, so I'd be even,
so that wouldn't even
yes,
work. Right?
the
So
dog would be my alibi.
here's another question. I don't know if you are familiar or pay attention to true crime podcasts or anything like that, but do you give credence to true crime podcasts, especially considering Michelle McNamara's sent toward D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer?
I honestly could not tell you. I actually had a student today come up to me after class and ask me my opinion on a particular serial killer that I had never heard of before. I don't know enough about any of this to really offer an opinion one way or the other. As potentially upsetting as this is to people watching, serial killers are such a rare criminal type that a lot of criminologists don't spend a whole lot of time studying them because they happen so infrequently. And so I couldn't offer a real strong opinion one way or the other on that.
Oh, really? So the idea of a serial killer is like, it happens so infrequently. Let's study things that happen more. So what are some of the things that would potentially be studied more versus the idea of studying a serial killer?
A tremendous amount of criminological research is actually geared toward juvenile delinquency. And so we typically try and look at things like, minor drug use, theft, some sexual assault stuff, maybe homicides we're interested in, but not necessarily these kind of high profile homicides, just kind of, and not to be insensitive, but you're kind of run of the mill homicide, burglary, robbery, arson. Those are kind of more of the crimes that, because they are the lion's share of the crime that takes place, those are the ones that we typically look at, and specifically ones that are done by juveniles.
So my sister's like, so no Criminal Minds.
Criminal Minds I used to really enjoy watching that show. It is, unfortunately, it's one of those things kind of like jury profiling, that criminal profiling, there's not a whole lot of science behind it. And it's not particularly useful because it might narrow down your list of possible suspects to like only, 2/3 of Boston instead of the whole city. And so it's not, it's very, very hard to have a profile direct you to an individual person. And oftentimes when profiles are used, when they finally catch the suspect, they're wrong. And so it's really kind of more of an art than a science as it's portrayed in that show. So.
Well, no, I mean, what you just said is kind of like the DC sniper, right? So I remember when they first started talking about the DC sniper, they were like, well, it's got to be a white male. And these are the things that is. And then here it is. Here's a black man and his black son, right? So you're like, oh, this is nothing like what they were starting to lay it out as.
The other kind of problem is if you have 3 different profiles, you're going to have 3 complete different profiles also. And so the profiles are so dependent on the profiler that, I wouldn't want to go to 3 different doctors and get 3 different medical opinions, because then it would seem like no one knows what they're talking about. Yet that's exactly what happens with criminal profiling, is depending on the profile, or depends on the profile you get, which is problematic.
This is great, man. So did you play Clue as a kid?
I play Clue as an adult still. And so I love Clue.
So the question is, are you any good at it?
Not any better than it. It depends on if I'm, Professor Plum, and if I roll a couple 6s, and if I,
you know what? That's what maybe we should do for Halloween. You could go as Professor Plum, right? You come with a knife, and you did it in the student rec center. So there you go.
Yeah, that seems like. Will you be my alibi when the police come?
I could be. What is it, Mr. Mustard or whatever the hell?
Colonel Mustard.
Right? Colonel Mustard, right? That's a great question. That's great. I love it. So moving on to the next little discussion piece for criminology. Another thing you had talked about was crime theories. So do you mind just explaining what you mean by crime theory? Because when I gave what I thought my definition of what crime theory was and your explanation, they were going off in 2 different directions. So do you mind just explaining what crime theory is?
Right. So any sort of policy that we have in criminology has a theory that kind of backs it up. So theory and policy are very intimately involved. And basically what criminal theories are just theories to explain why people commit crime, right? And so every policy we have has a theory that backs it up. So, for example, speeding tickets, right? If I'm driving down 95 and I'm going 95, I get a $200 ticket or whatever the case may be. And the theory behind that is I won't want to pay $200 to the government, and so that will cause me to slow down when I'm driving down 95. And so these are all just kind of different explanations. And what's very interesting is that a lot of different disciplines, especially in social science, find crime very interesting. And so they all have come up with explanations for why crime happens. Just some of them are just wrong, right? And so they're the best theories explain the widest breadth of crimes and also they're empirically valid and also have logical policies that kind of tie into those theories so that we can actually do something about stopping crime.
Okay. So my next question would be, what is the biggest reason, I guess, from a theoretical standpoint, of why people commit crimes?
So this is, I'm going to admit my bias here to this. There are like 2 or 3 major schools of thought on why people commit crime. There's a kind of control theories of crime where it's a breakdown in controls in our lives in some capacity. There's strain theories that suggest there's some sort of strain that people are feeling in their lives, whether that's monetary or otherwise. And then there's learning theories of crime. The leading learning theorist, his name is Ron Akers, and he is who taught me theory as a graduate student. And so I was trained under him. So I obviously have a very heavy lean toward his kind of theoretical approach. But the basic idea is that criminal behavior is really not unlike any other behavior in our lives. It's just learned behavior that basically you learn from the people you hang around with, and it's behavior you get reinforced for. And it's also behavior that you can define as non-criminal. And so we all will, in our lives in some capacity or another, kind of define certain acts as bad or not. Whenever I teach this to undergrads, I always say, no one in here is a criminal, right? And no one raise your hand, but has no one drank underage? That's illegal. Right? Does that make you a criminal? And it's like, well, oh, come on, drinking underage isn't really crime, right? And to watch how we kind of go through it's only marijuana, right? It's not really drugs. It's not like I'm taking heroin. And we'll start doing these kind of justifications to say, well, I'm not actually a criminal. I'm not actually committing crime because that behavior is not really a crime. And so we kind of change the definitions. We might get reinforced to do it. You might have your friends who you hang out with, who you associate with, saying things like, come on, it's cool, let's shotgun a White Claw. And next thing you know, you're well on your way to being defined as a criminal in the strictest sense of the definition.
What's funny, I was just talking about that in my food and beverage class, and it shows the mentality of rationalization of some things. So I asked how many of them are responsible for theft in that establishment. Of course, everybody says no. And then as I start asking questions, well, how many of you have just gone to the back and grab a handful of this or taken that, not ring it up? And they're like, yeah, that's different though. Right. So there's the big different there. So do you follow the Gray Kelly case out of the Cedar Park, Texas? Any opinions on the docuseries?
I could not tell you a thing about it, honestly. And if it's on Netflix or anything else, I probably haven't watched it, and I might not get around to watching it. So I honestly have no opinion or knowledge.
And actually, Joel, do you mind expanding on that? Because is that the one where the guy took his kids and put them in the oil well? I can't remember.
I'm familiar with that. If that is that one, then I am.
But I can't remember the dude, and if that is the one on Netflix. So Joel, if you don't mind expanding, or somebody who's tuned in, if that's the one that you're referring to, because I think I've seen the docuseries on it on Netflix. If that's the one, Joel is like, no, that's not it. Let's see, that was Chris Watts. Okay, so I remember that one. Let's see, no, Chris something. So hopefully Joel will let us know. But yeah, I'm not familiar with that one either. So once Joel kind of gives us a little more background, we can have you answer that question. So next little tidbit I want to discuss is kind of criminal justice policy. And there were just several policies that are, I would say, hot button topics that people are really interested in. I just want to get your take on some of these. Here we go. Let's see. Oh, he was the football player wrongly convicted for child sexual assault. I'm not too familiar with that one. Are you familiar with this case,
I'm not.
Josh?
I do actually. Wrongful convictions is actually something that my advisor, and I'm part of the American Psychology and Law Society, and that's something that we take very, very seriously. And we work closely with the Innocence Project, and it is wrongful convictions. I think are one of the biggest, if not the largest possible miscarriage of justice that our system has. That's one of the things about our system. Going back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, that
The
actually,
fairness question? Mhm.
yeah, that I feel very, very strongly about, that I really, really don't like at all, is if anyone is ever convicted for a crime they didn't do, technically it's supposed to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean guilt beyond all doubt. That doesn't mean you have to be 100% sure. So there is a margin of error there. But I think that if we find out that we've convicted somebody for something that they didn't do, that not only do we need to let them out, we need to give them as much as we possibly can to help rebuild their lives, because we've taken away the most valuable resource they have on this planet, which is time, right? And we've done that incorrectly as a government, which I have large problems with.
So I just want to say this real quick. Joel, thank you so much for providing all that information. I appreciate you tuning in. I'm going to have to do a little bit more checking out on that, because that does interest me, because that's something we do hear a lot about. And they're like, hey, here's the wrongful conviction. So the Outcry and the docu-series on Showtime, it makes you want to run through a wall to fix parts of our legal system, and more people like you, Josh, fighting for them. So appreciate your comments, Joel. Thank you for tuning in. That is, I'm not going to lie, as a man of color who one time was grabbed by the police as a young teen, I was worried I was going to be taken away for something that I was actually had no possibility of being a part of, had no possibility of being part of a purse snatching. Thank God my dad was there, who, as I mentioned, 30 years in law enforcement, walks over and is talking, but the woman still had to come over. They said, hey, is this the kid? She looks, she goes, no, I don't think that's the kid. And then goes, no, that's not the kid. But if not for my dad being there and being a law enforcement officer, I don't think the situation is diffused or as calm as it takes place, because he wasn't there at first, and they grabbed me, they throw me up against the car, they're frisking me. You know what I mean? It was, and I thought, here it is. I'm going away. So.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things that's a problem with innocent people when they're getting interrogated, you get Miranda read to you, but if you're innocent, why would you not talk? Why would you get a lawyer? That makes you look guilty. So I'm not going to do any of those things because I'm innocent. And the best advice I have for anyone, regardless of who you are, regardless of if you're innocent or not, is an interrogation legally has to stop the minute you ask for a lawyer. Ask for a lawyer no matter what, anytime, because every part of interviewing you has to immediately cease until a lawyer gets there. And you don't want to put yourself in a position where you've been interrogated for 12 hours. The police come in and say, if you just sign this piece of paper, you can go home. And so you're like, fine, I'll sign anything to just get out of here. It's 12 hours. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I got to go to the bathroom. I'm emotionally exhausted from getting yelled at for 12 hours. And then you don't realize you've just signed a confession that you did it. And now you're going away for a while. To answer this question here, you do not get automatic compensation. There's some states that will compensate you. Last time I checked, this might be outdated information, the most generous state, ironically enough, is Texas, and they give you $100,000 per year of wrongful conviction. But a lot of states also that do compensation say if you contributed in any way to your wrongful conviction, you can no longer recover. So if you confessed under duress, you can no longer recover.
Oh my gosh.
Because you contributed to your conviction. Yeah, it's absolutely insane.
That's crazy. So to continue the criminology conversation around criminal justice policy, there are several that are out there. One that is coming up is we're seeing a lot of the legalization of recreational marijuana usage taking place. What are your thoughts on how convictions of those types of drug charges should be handled once a state legalizes marijuana for those people that have been convicted of that crime?
So that's a very interesting question. And there's also a very interesting kind of disparity here, because there's federal marijuana laws that are still in the books. And then there's state laws that say, well, you can go ahead and do it. So like technically the DEA still could come in and arrest you for selling marijuana, even if you have a state license to do so. And so there's this very interesting tension between the state and the federal systems here. What seems to make the most sense to me, but because it makes sense, it probably won't ever go through our government, is that if a state legalizes marijuana, anyone who was convicted of marijuana possession or marijuana sales prior to that should then automatically just be released from prison, because it just seems inconsistent that someone might be serving a 20-year prison sentence for something that is now legal to do. And so that's my opinion on what should happen in terms of policy. Is that what will happen? I mean, the struggle that politicians always wrestle with is not what is the best interest of their citizens, it's what's in the best interest of their electorate in order to get them reelected. And so there's a lot of criminal justice policies, and a lot of people don't advocate for them a lot, unless they're trying to advocate for kind of get tough policies, because they don't want to be accused of being soft on crime or giving too much money to criminal justice programs, because why are we dumping all of our taxpayer dollars into these bad people?
Okay. A couple other things I want to run through real quick, just some policies that I guess you considered hot button topics, and you can just give a quick thought on them. So one is that I found was law enforcement, or the defunding of, or as I like to say, reallocation of funding of the police department. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that it's overwhelmingly a bad idea. There are some, I understand the arguments for defunding the police, but I think that it ignores the reality of the world. There are times where there is someone running around with a gun trying to shoot people, right? Sending in or having less law enforcement, which means longer response times, really does then have an effect. One of the things from a fearless conversation we had at Flagler that the student member actually suggested, which I think is brilliant, is that the police departments should hire law enforcement officers that go through the academy, that carry a gun, that have a badge, that also are social workers or also have mental health counseling. There's no reason why we need mental health counselors separate and apart from law enforcement. Why not be smarter with our resources and just start prioritizing and giving incentives to people that have mental health counsel training to become sworn law enforcement officers?
Actually, that was a great fearless conversation. I do remember seeing that one. Another one that has come up, or that continues to be discussed, death penalty.
I personally am against it. I don't know how you can. I don't really know how we can justify it. It's way more expensive. We know we've executed innocent people, which I think is horrendous, and so there's no real advantage to having it.
All right, and the last one we'll talk about before we move into the next little piece is the stand your ground kind of laws. What are your thoughts on the stand your ground laws? I know this is a lot of stuff that we're trying to kind of condense down.
The very quick answer is we can't look at stand your ground laws in a vacuum, right? So what was happening is there used to be kind of a rule that you had to retreat to the furthest possible point before you could defend yourself in any capacity. So the idea is you need to try and defuse a situation, try and get out of it, try and run away. And if all of that fails, you then can use deadly force. And if you have a firearm, you can use it. What ended up happening is older people that were not quite as mobile, would be trying to retreat, and they'd either pull their gun out too early and get sued or get arrested for using their gun too early, or they would get overtaken and hurt or killed because they just couldn't get away. And so the pendulum kind of swung the other direction that said, why in the world are we handicapping the good guy in this situation by saying you have all these duties to retreat, instead of saying to the criminals, hey, if you play a stupid game, you might win a stupid prize here, right? And so I am not as fervently opposed to stand your ground laws as much as other people probably are in that capacity.
Cool. Do you mind elaborating on this question real quick before we move to the next case?
Death penalty cases, because they're capital cases, number one, they go through automatic appeals. So you do a second trial automatically to make sure that it's not an arbitrary and capricious death sentence. Also, the sentence is death. The sentence is not incarceration. And so because of that, any rights and privileges that the general population of inmates have, death row inmates get also. However, they are required to be housed in single cells. So that means that if all of the general population inmates have access to TV in some capacity, you have to provide them the ability to have access to TV, to have books, to have legal visits, to have all of those privileges. And as much as people want to initially bristle and be like, but they're death row inmates, we don't need to give them privileges, it's still not luxurious. Please don't misinterpret that as they're living in a Hilton or anything. But then also, there's a tremendous amount of resources used to guard a special unit that has individual cells, to have an execution chamber, to have an execution team that needs to train for all of this. So the average cost of housing someone, and these numbers are a little old, but it's something like about $750,000 to house someone for life in prison, and about $1.2 million to execute somebody, even though they're living less time, presumably, because of all those additional things that they need.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I appreciate it. And as we get to the last couple of little talking bits, criminal infatuation, right, was the last thing I wanted to talk about. A lot of people get infatuated with criminals. So I wanted to ask you this question. Do you have a quote unquote coolest criminal that you research, or a coolest criminal that you would say, oh, this one seems to be head and shoulders above the rest as far as people researching? And why do you think they're considered the coolest criminal, if that's a fair way to put it?
Right. So I don't know that I have a particular criminal person that I find the most interesting, because criminology is a subfield of sociology. I have always been very, very fascinated by the Italian mafia. And so you could pick some people within the Italian mafia, I suppose, but there was so much from a sociological perspective that was kind of the perfect storm to allow the mafia to exist. And then the power that they got it's just fascinating to me as a social scientist to kind of view all of the things and all the subtleties of the Italian mafia that made them so successful.
So, this is my sister. She loves her Murder Mystery Mondays. So the next question I have, as far as the criminal infatuation, you mentioned, the coolest being the mafia. Is there any one person or any one particular, I guess, crime syndicate or anything like that you have studied more than the others?
No, I mainly study juries and witness behavior, and so okay. I haven't really spent a lot of time studying any particular groups in that capacity. So I'm sorry if that's a disappointing answer.
No, it's not a disappointing answer. So I'm going to go ahead and follow up with this last one. If you can follow or try to research one, is there anyone that would catch your eye that you would say, let me go ahead and see if I'd research that person?
And I wish I could remember his name now. There was a member of the mob. He was a crime boss that used to walk around the streets of New York in like a robe and pretended like he was kind of mentally ill and a little kind of crazy, socially unaware, but was actually the crime boss of one of the 5 major families. And I can't remember his name now, but probably him, because he was able to get away with it for a decently long amount of time, because the police were like, oh, who in the world is this guy? And why is he like drooling on himself out at a restaurant right now? But he was just kind of playing an act for years and decades as this crime boss of one of the major crime families in New York. So that would probably be someone that I'd like to.
That would be the one. And it's funny, the one that comes to mind, growing up in New York, we all knew about John Gotti, right?
Of course.
And he was held in such high regard. And even to this day, I find myself at times defending John Gotti to people, right? So here, he's a mob boss, and I'm like, well, he really wasn't that bad of a guy, right? So I'm like defending.
Well, and in the abundance of fairness, like there's actually really strong justifications for why the Italian mob happened. Like it makes sense because of the severe anti-Italian sentiment in America, why the Italian mob was so loved and almost viewed as necessary in order to give Italian Americans actual equal rights in our country. And so that's obviously a conversation for another day, though.
It is. I was going to say we could go for a long time. So I want to go ahead and start wrapping this up. Josh, thank you so much for coming on. And I just want to give you an opportunity to give your last thoughts here at the Rant and Rave with Dave. So go ahead and take it away, my friend.
And I will keep this brief, but I one of the things I would encourage everybody to think about as they're talking about this, as they watch crime movies and TV shows, is to remember that the difference between a criminal and a non-criminal, just about 100% of the time, is that the criminals are the ones that got caught. We've all done stuff in our lives that probably could get us defined as a criminal. We were just potentially fortunate enough to not get caught when we were doing it. And so when we try and look at why are we other criminals, and we look at inmates, and again, I'm not suggesting go up and hug people as they're walking out of jail or anything, but just remember that like when we are trying to explain these different behaviors from everybody else, really, we've committed a lot of these same potential behaviors. And that's kind of my final thought on the study of crime in general.
Josh, I tell you what, thank you so much. This conversation far exceeded my expectations. Every time you speak, I learn a lot. I enjoy listening to you speak. I enjoy listening to you speak on your passion. Hopefully we can get you back on and we can continue this conversation and take it a little bit deeper. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So just to let everybody know, again, if you have a chance, go ahead and hit that like and share button. So this way we can get as many people on this train of Rolling the Dice with Dave. Next week, we are actually heading into Black History Month, and I'm bringing back another guest. So the individual who is going to be coming is Ronnie Parker. He is a former student at East Carolina University. He is now the Chief Diversity Officer, or one of the diversity officers of Hampton Roads Chamber. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is that Black history is American history. So I'm really looking forward to kicking off Black History Month with Ronnie Parker next week. I think it's going to be a great conversation. Hopefully many of you can join in. We do have a couple of more comments that came in. They just want to say, hey, Josh, that they loved it. Thank you so much for joining. Hey, Joel, anytime, Josh. So they're glad, and they want to thank you again. So again, everybody, I hope you have a wonderful night. Josh, again, I had a great time talking with you. Looking forward to having you on the show again sometime soon. Everybody, good night.